Hello, my name is Steve Myers. In this video I'm going to examine the overlooked human science in psychological types. In summary, my argument is that we have interpreted Jung's book in a way that he was not happy with, and as a result we have missed some of his most important and useful ideas. I'm going to focus on three areas. The first area is attitude. The popular reading of psychological types is that the term attitude refers to extroversion and introversion. When these two attitudes are combined with Jung's four functions, we get 8 function attitudes and 16 psychological types. Each of our personalities is based on one of those 16 structures. But from Jung's perspective, the term attitude had a much broader meaning. Typology was only an exemplar, albeit an important one. Alongside typological attitudes, there are also individual and social ones. Attitudes can be political, religious and cultural. This means that our psyche is complex and unique. We each have an individual structure. Although in some cases it may be dominated by typological functions, in other cases it may be dominated by something else. The second area is ontology, or the nature of reality. In the popular reading of Jung's book, psychological type acts as a common filter on the way that we perceive reality. That is, there is only one reality, but we view it in one of 16 different ways, according to our type. However, Jung uses his book to introduce his philosophy, called Esse in Anima, and his theory depends on that philosophy. In Esse in Anima, reality is ontologically relative and pluralistic. We will examine in detail what that means later, but in summary, we each have our own different but related realities. And sometimes those realities can be in direct contradiction to each other. The third area concerns psychological development. In the popular reading of Jung's book, our psychological type is inborn and remains the same throughout life. It defines a pattern of development in which the superior function always remains superior. Although we can develop the inferior function to some extent, it always remains the inferior function. For Jung, however, the concept of maturity was problematic because it emphasises collectivity over the individual. Jung's intention was for development to involve a transformation, which can sometimes be uncomfortable for both self and others. It involves radical and ongoing changes to the personality that make some superior-inferior structures obsolete and replaces them with new structures. To explore these issues, there are 5 sections in this presentation. We'll start with a brief review of Jung's complaints about the misreading of his book. We'll then look at how to view psychological types, now known as Collected Work 6. And we'll then look at the 3 issues I've identified: the complexity of attitudes, ontological relativity, and the transformation of personality. Jung first became aware of some confusion over his philosophy in 1925 and tried to clarify it after a seminar. But he offered an explanation that added to the confusion rather than clarified it. By the early 1930s, Jung realised that the whole book had been misunderstood, and there are lots of examples to show that he remained unhappy about this through to the end of his life. In 1934, he wrote a new foreword that was scathing about readers' use of type to categorise people. He told readers to ignore the chapter that described the personality types and to look at chapters 2 and 5 instead. But those chapters made very difficult reading. In 1935, he complained in a letter that most readers had missed the main point of his book. Also, at some point, he suggested that if you identify with a type, then you identify with a corpse. In 1937, he wrote another foreword saying there was no point in revising the book when the basics had not been understood. He also came to the conclusion that lay people could not use typological theory correctly. In 1950, he refused to meet Isabel Briggs Myers, even though he had met her in the 1930s. When asked about her work in 1957, he replied, "God preserve me from my friends." And in 1959, he refused to help a PhD student with research using the MBTI. The reason he gave was that it did not coincide with the purpose of his book. Much of the blame for the misunderstanding lies at Jung's door. One major problem was that he gave the book a strange structure, because he was aiming it at a lay audience. In the first foreword he wrote, "My concern is to show how the ideas can be linked up with an existing body of knowledge, which will enable the educated layman to derive some profit from them." What he did, therefore, was write 9 chapters that are, in effect, a literature review. He then wove all his ideas into those historical discussions. This structure obfuscated his message because those 9 chapters were, for most people, incomprehensible. Therefore, readers took the other 2 chapters, 10 and 11, to be the main content of the book. But they were, in effect, appendices. There were several other things that made the book difficult to read, including Jung's circumambulatory writing style, translation issues, complex cross-references, mistaken assumptions about the knowledge of readers, lack of clear explanations for certain important concepts, and so on. If we want to understand the messages in the book that Jung claimed were overlooked, then we have to look at it in a certain way. To help understand that perspective, I'm going to draw on the writings of Karl Popper. He was a philosopher of science whose PhD was in psychology. Popper described 2 different ways of developing knowledge, one using a philosophical approach and the other a scientific approach. You might have a different understanding of these terms, but in this presentation we are going to use Popper's definitions. This is because Popper uses these terms with a very specific meaning, which helps us to understand the content of psychological types. In Popper's philosophical approach, we demonstrate that something is true. For example, we might start with a set of premises, and then build a rational argument that proves how a conclusion follows from those premises. If something can't be demonstrated, then it is not a valid conclusion. In science, however, we start with a set of problems, and then we mythologize about solutions to those problems. We come up with imaginative ideas, perhaps even crazy ideas, by making an intuitive leap. Popper called this conjecture. There is then a second stage in which we test the mythology we have just produced by trying to show it is false. Popper called this second stage refutation. If the mythology survives the test of falsification, then we have a new, improved scientific myth. This myth doesn't solve every problem. In fact, it can bring a new set of problems. This means that the advancement of scientific myth involves going from one set of problems to another, through conjecture and refutation. The difference between philosophy and science, according to Popper, is that philosophy demonstrates conclusions, whereas science improves its myths. Popper said, "All our scientific theories are myths. My thesis is that what we call science is differentiated from the older myths, not by being something distinct from a myth, but by being accompanied by a second-order tradition, by which he means refutation. Under the pressure of criticism, the myths are forced to adapt themselves to the task of giving us an adequate and a more detailed picture of the world in which we live. This explains why scientific myths, under the pressure of criticism, become so different from religious myths. I think, however, we should be quite clear that in their origin they remain myths or inventions, just like the others." And he sums up the difference between a philosophical and scientific approach by describing how they each use criticism. Scientific criticism tries to find consequences which are unacceptable. That's falsification. Philosophical criticism tries to show that the assertion is not really demonstrable. A good example of someone who took a scientific approach is Albert Einstein. He had a big influence on Popper, which led to him developing his philosophy of science that is based on myth. Einstein started with a problem, which was the paradoxical evidence of Newtonian mechanics and electromagnetism. He then made an imaginative or intuitive leap to come up with his new myth, the theory of special relativity. Einstein said, "All great achievements of science must start from intuitive knowledge. I believe in intuition and inspiration." So when we look at psychological types, we can ask the question, is it a philosophical work or a scientific work? In Chapter 1, Jung introduces his new philosophy of esse in anima. As we shall see later, this is fundamental to some of the human science in various parts of the book. However, the fact that the book is based on a philosophy does not necessarily mean that it must have been produced using a philosophical approach. Let's return to Popper for a moment. He argues that the scientific approach, based on myth and the criticism of myth, began with Parmenides and continued through to the time of Plato. Although Parmenides was a philosopher and he produced what we might call a philosophy, it was nevertheless created using what Popper identifies as a scientific approach. There is a difference between the approach and the product. So, the question we should ask of Jung's work is not whether the product is a philosophy, but whether the approach he took starts with premises or problems, and whether he demonstrates his conclusions or produces ideas by mythologizing. These questions help us determine whether Jung took what Popper describes as a philosophical or a scientific approach when writing psychological types. The answer to the first question is that Jung starts with problems. Psychological types is concerned with the type problem, or the problem of opposites, and the various personal, relational and societal problems that are created as a result. You can see Jung's emphasis on problems even on the contents page, where the word problem appears in 8 out of the 11 chapter headings. And when Jung characterised the content of the book in a letter, he said that it was all about the problem of opposites. In the problem of opposites lies the gravamen of the book. So in answer to the first question, does Jung start with premises or problems? Then the answer is that he starts with problems, which is the starting point for Popper's scientific approach. The answer to the second question, as to whether he demonstrates a conclusion or mythologizes about solutions, is summed up well by Claire Krellin in her book on Jung's theory of personality. She says that Psychological Types is a cryptic work hiding some of Jung's most radical ideas. Psychological Types is a book of ideas, a book that seeks to create a new mythology that describes how to overcome the problem of opposites. Again, in Popper's scheme, this is a scientific approach. There are also some other pointers in this direction. For example, just as Einstein had a big influence on Popper, so too he had a big influence on Jung. Between 1895 and 1914, Einstein lived for most of the time in Switzerland. In the latter years, Einstein lived in Zurich, only about 5 miles or so from Jung's house. Einstein was an occasional dinner guest at the Jung home. Although Jung declared himself to be a thinking type at that time, he admired Einstein's intuition and sought to cultivate it in himself. In later years, when a correspondent compared Isaac Newton with Freud and Albert Einstein with Jung, Jung liked the analogy and wrote, "Freud is essentially concretistic, like Newton, and I'm chiefly impressed by the relativity of psychological phenomena." Both Einstein's approach and the innovative nature of his theories had an influence on Jung. Another factor to consider is that Jung repeatedly claimed he was not a philosopher. He said he approaches matters from a scientific and not from a philosophical standpoint. There are many critics who think this claim is untenable, one reason being that his psychology was heavily dependent on his philosophy. However, I think we should take Jung at face value and interpret what he says from the perspective of Popper. Jung was seeking to emulate the type of approach that Einstein took, imagining radical solutions to intractable problems. He was producing his own theory of relativity, psychological relativity. Another thing to consider is that Jung saw science as myth, just as Popper did, and psychology as myth. In fact, psychology, not yet of course recognised as such, constitutes one element of the myth science. So my argument is that we should view Psychological Types not as a work of philosophy, but as an attempt at mythologizing, which is the first stage of science. Jung has tried to emulate Einstein by coming up with radical ideas to solve real-world problems, and by producing his own theory of psychological relativity. Whatever the cause, most readers have missed several important messages in the book. They have missed the complexity of attitudes and the relevance of the book to politics, religion and culture. They have missed its message about the psychological relativity of reality. And they have missed Jung's solution to the problem of opposites, which is based on personal transformation. So let's take a look at the first of these areas, the complexity of attitudes. Although attitude is an important concept in Psychological Types, Jung buries that importance in a complex network of cross-references. In his definitions chapter, he defines a psychological type by saying, in the sense used in this particular work, a type is a characteristic specimen of a general attitude. If we follow the cross-reference to attitude, Jung defines it by saying, for us, attitude is a readiness of the psyche to act or react in a certain way. This automatic phenomenon is an essential cause of the one-sidedness of conscious orientation. If we then follow the cross-reference to orientation, we find some more information that expands on Jung's meaning. He says he uses this term to denote the general principle governing an attitude. Every attitude is oriented by a certain viewpoint. And Jung gives 3 examples: a power attitude, a thinking or logical attitude, and a sensation or facts-oriented attitude. 2 of these are typological attitudes, but one is not, the power attitude. So we are beginning to see that there is more to type than the typological functions. Each function corresponds to an attitude, but there can be lots of attitudes in addition to typological ones. These are not just isolated quotes in a large book, it is a major theme. This is illustrated by the fact that Jung uses the word attitude in various ways nearly 450 times throughout psychological types. And if we go back to his definition of attitude, we find more non-typological examples. He uses 2 examples to show how the conscious attitude is compensated by an unconscious attitude. The first example is unpleasantness. Every man who is particularly aware of the seamy side of existence, for instance, will naturally have an attitude that is constantly on the lookout for something unpleasant. This conscious imbalance is compensated by an unconscious expectation of pleasure. His second example is oppression. He says, again, an oppressed person has a conscious attitude that always anticipates oppression. He selects this factor from the general run or experience and sends it out everywhere. His unconscious attitude, therefore, aims at power and superiority. Psychological Types is a book about a wide range of attitudes, of which the typological functions are just examples, although very significant and frequently occurring examples. And in the conclusion to the definition of attitude, Jung identifies 3 main types. The first is that there is an individual attitude. The second form of attitude arises when a typological function dominates, and there is thus a typical thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuitive attitude. And for the third type, there are also social attitudes, namely those on which a collective idea has set its stamp. So the psyche comprises a wide range of attitudes, in both consciousness and the unconscious, and the typological functions represent just one example. This is confirmed in the rest of the book, where Jung discusses political, religious, and cultural attitudes. Jung expands on how these attitudes relate in an essay a few years after the publication of Psychological Types on Weltanschauung. A worldview is a sort of overall attitude that an individual has developed. Jung illustrates the role of different attitudes within the psyche using the analogy of an army commander. He equates the army commander with the ego and says, if we compare our psychic contents to an army and the various forms of attitude to military dispositions, then attention, for example, would be represented by a concentrated force standing to arms, surrounded by reconnoitring parties. As soon as the strength and position of the enemy are known, the disposition changes. The army begins to move in the direction of a given objective. In precisely the same way, the psychic attitude changes. There are, of course, further complexities that Jung discusses in this essay and in Psychological Types. For example, he develops the analogy to consider the relation between particular dispositions and an overall plan of attack. But this essay builds on Psychological Types by emphasizing the complexity and richness of this theory of attitude. So, the first overlooked aspect of human science in Psychological Types is the complexity and uniqueness of attitudes in the individual. The popular reading of Psychological Types, as expressed in Myers-Briggs theory, focuses only on typological functions and treats each type as representing a worldview. But for Jung, typological attitudes are something that a worldview makes use of. The type functions are only exemplars of attitude, albeit frequently occurring and important ones. There are other attitudes as well, including social and individual ones. In chapters 2 and 5, Jung examines what happens to the structure of the psyche when an attitude is differentiated in consciousness. That attitude becomes superior and the opposite attitude remains in the unconscious and becomes inferior. However, this relation of superior and inferior is not limited to typological functions. It applies to any and all attitudes, including politics, religion, and culture. The second aspect of human science that has been overlooked is how those complex attitudes create an ontologically relative external world. In Psychological Types, Jung introduces his philosophy of esse in anima, the implications of which are very significant. It is stranger than we realise. Esse in anima suggests that the attitudes in our psyche are not merely filters on the world around us, but they help create a different world that is unique to our own psyche. It is the psychological equivalent to Einstein's theory of special relativity. Jung did not actually use the term ontological relativity, although it expresses an essential element of esse in anima. The term ontological relativity was coined by the philosopher W.V.O. Quine. He got the idea from John Dewey, who suggested that the mind and the world are not separate, but they are part of the same world. Therefore, reality is not something we perceive, but it is something we co-create through the interaction of our psyche and the world around us. Reality is therefore different for each of us. Quine focused on the role that language plays in creating reality, but there are other factors as well, such as our experiences or our position in the world. We can see ontological relativity at work in the Doppler effect. In this scenario, a truck driver is hurtling along. He sees someone standing in the road, presses the horn, and does an emergency stop. There are two people standing on the pavement. The driver of the truck hears a constant pitch from the horn throughout the emergency stop and afterwards. The first pedestrian hears a descending pitch for a short time, then a large drop in pitch as the truck passes, then the pitch rises again for a long time, and when the truck stops the pitch becomes constant. The second pedestrian hears a descending pitch for a long time, then a small drop in pitch, then the pitch rises again for a short time, and finally it is constant. The person standing in the road hears a descending pitch followed by a constant pitch when the truck has stopped. All four people hear a different pattern of pitch. There are other differences as well, for example concerning patterns of volume. These patterns do not exist purely in the outer world, nor purely in the mind of each person. They are different but related realities that are created through the interaction of an event in the world and each individual. Ontological relativity means that reality is relative to both the individual and the external world. Quine and Jung got their ideas from a common source. Quine was influenced most directly by John Dewey, who said we don't have different experiences or perceptions of a single reality, but reality is pluralistic, and we each have our own slightly different realities that are nevertheless closely linked or related. That is, we don't have different experiences of the real, we each have different reals of experience. Dewey was influenced by William James, who in his late developed philosophy of radical empiricism saw reality as lying at the intersection of mind and world. Reality is produced through the interaction of the two, as illustrated by the Doppler example, and also through the interactions between interactions. Jung used James's ideas in his own philosophy of esse in anima. He didn't acknowledge James as a source, but William Koch has demonstrated how very close their two philosophies are. And the two men spent a couple of evenings together when Jung was visiting the United States. There may not be a smoking gun, but there is plenty of circumstantial evidence to show that Jung used William James's ideas. Jung illustrated the principle of reality being created through interactions using the colour green, which does not have an independent existence of its own, but is produced through the interaction of an external wavelength and the psyche. Although Jung didn't illustrate the idea of interactions between interactions, we can see it in the example of a national flag. In a flag, the colour green interacts with other colours, their spatial positioning and our own psyche to represent a particular nation. We co-create reality through interactions with the external world and with interactions between interactions. What is unique and innovative about Jung's work is that he put this philosophy together with his theory of opposites that was influenced by Friedrich Schiller and Carl Spittler in chapters 2 and 5 of Psychological Types respectively. Schiller's writings help to describe the problem of opposites. Schiller hints at a solution, but Spittler's writings develop that solution in much greater depth. Schiller suggested that an individual tends to develop a particular attitude, which, as we have seen, need not only be typological but can take many other forms. What Schiller demonstrates is that the attitude we develop tends to become one-sided and develop superior qualities. It is sophisticated, nuanced, and has an inherent integrity. The opposite to that attitude tends to be repressed in the unconscious, where it has inferior qualities. It is incoherent, inconsistent, confused, simplistic, and mixed up with all sorts of primitive emotions and instincts. Jung combines his theory of opposites with his philosophy by suggesting that if the psyche is involved in creating reality, and the psyche contains a superior-inferior dynamic, then the reality of the world will also contain a superior-inferior dynamic. Reality is a bit like a hologram, a three-dimensional image that is created through the interaction of two light sources. One source is the external world, the other source is our own psyche that has a superior-inferior structure. Jung illustrates this in various places. For example, in his analysis of Nietzsche, the reality of the Apollonian and Dionysian impulses is shaped by Nietzsche's own superior and inferior attitudes. By examining how the superior and inferior qualities appear in the world that Nietzsche describes, it is possible to work backwards and establish the attitudes that were superior and inferior in Nietzsche's psyche. Can I just take you back for a moment to my discussion of Popper? Although Essay in Anima is a philosophy, Jung did not produce it using a philosophical approach, and he has not justified it using a robust philosophical argument. Rather, he took the approach that we now recognise as being scientific, at least as Karl Popper sees it. Jung considered psychological problems, such as the conflict of opposites, or whether reality is in the world or in the mind, and from those paradoxes he came up with an imaginative idea, or perhaps pinched an idea from William James, that reality is created through interactions. But what is missing from this scientific approach is the second stage, that of refutation, of trying to falsify the theory. Jung was strong on coming up with imaginative ideas, but weak on putting those ideas to an empirical test. Therefore, I have conducted some tests myself with the aim of trying to falsify Jung's theory. The report of those tests will be appearing in the IJJS this autumn. In short, I've been unable to falsify the theory, and the data supports the idea of ontological relativity. This doesn't prove anything. We can't prove anything in Popper's philosophy of science, but it does suggest there is some value in the myth that Jung describes in Psychological Types, that we each participate in the construction of our own reality, and that reality reflects the superior-inferior structure in our own psyche. What I've done in these tests, therefore, is use natural science to show that there is validity in a human science aspect of Jung's theory. This gives a new significance to asking questions such as, what sort of world do you live in? And using the superior and inferior qualities people observe to understand the unique structure of their personal attitudes. So, the second overlooked aspect of human science in Psychological Types is that reality is ontologically relative. Our psyche is a participant in the creation of the world around us. As a result, we each have different realities that are shaped in part by the complexity and uniqueness of attitudes in the individual. This gives an added dimension for human science to investigate. What is the unique nature and experience of the world around? How does the reality of one person relate to the reality of another? And how does that reality relate to the superior-inferior structure of the individual's attitudes? This leads us into the final overlooked aspect of human science in Jung's book, the transformation of personality. Psychological types describes how our complex attitudes can be transformed through the transcendent function. As a result, the reality of the world we live in also changes. I'm not proposing to say a lot about the transcendent function because it is already covered extensively elsewhere. However, there are a couple of additional points in psychological types that I'd like to draw out. As we've already mentioned, Jung highlighted chapters 2 and 5 as containing the main content of psychological types. These chapters review the work of Schiller and Spittler. Jung weaves his understanding of the problem of opposites into the chapter on Schiller. He weaves his solution into the chapter on Spittler, into his epic poem about the two brothers Prometheus and Epimetheus. Jung concludes chapter 5 by explaining the meaning of Spittler's poem and by adding his own implied epilogue that clarifies Jung's solution. The opposites have been reconciled through the emergence of a symbol that represents the transcendent function and a new attitude. However, in chapter 5, there are actually two symbols that can reconcile the opposites, not one. The first symbol of reconciliation that appears in the middle of the story is Pandora's jewel. Pandora's jewel is sent by the angel of the Lord to help the people overcome the division between opposites. To cut a long story short, everyone has the opportunity to benefit from this symbol, but they reject it as alarming, shameful and worthless. They adhere to their one-sided standpoint. As a result, they lose control of their own destiny, and the second reconciling symbol is imposed on them through a disaster. So we need to be on the lookout for our own Pandora's jewels, which can reconcile conflict before we experience the disaster. The symbol of Messias only comes at the end of a story in which we have rejected the earlier opportunity for transformation. In Spittler's story, Pandora's jewel was rejected by the whole of society and by the collective attitudes that were held in high esteem. Government, education, religion, commerce and social conscience all thought it was worthless, shameful, abhorrent and alarming. But the symbol provided a relatively pain-free opportunity for transformation. The lesson of the symbol applies equally to individual or collective attitudes, and to individuals or society as a whole. It can transform any form of attitude. For this reason, Jung saw Spittler's work as more important than that of Goethe and Nietzsche. In Psychological Types he wrote, "Faust and Zarathustra are of very great assistance in the individual mastery of the problem, while Spittler's Prometheus and Epimetheus affords a more general insight into it and the way it appears in collective life. It expresses a transformation of attitude." Jung saw Goethe and Nietzsche's work as relevant to individual transformation, but Spittler's as applying to both the individual and society. It describes the transformation of both personal and collective attitudes. So, to inject a slight hint of controversy at the end of this presentation, can you think of any Pandora's jewels in politics? That is, are there any political parties or leaders, perhaps, who might alarm you, or who you think are shameful and have no soul? Is there someone who you view as morally worthless or as obscene? That might be a question that has an unpalatable answer, but Pandora's jewel was unpalatable. The point that Jung makes in chapter 5 of Psychological Types is that we can choose to reject those political leaders and parties, or we can view them symbolically as representing something deeper that is happening within ourselves and our political culture. If we can lay aside our disdain and pay attention to the symbolism, to let that deeper meaning unfold, then it can potentially start us on a path of reconciliation of the political divisions that are entrenched in our culture. This is the final aspect of human science that I'm pointing to in Jung's book. The transformation of attitude that overcomes the division in the world caused by a superior-inferior structure within ourselves. This form of transformation stops the superior-inferior structure from dominating our personalities and societies. It ushers in a new structure and a new attitude that carries the opposites on equal terms. When we put all three principles together, they present psychological types in a different light. It is not a book about categories of people, nor is it about a universal personality structure that is based on typological functions. It is much broader than that. It prompts us to ask a range of difficult questions about our complex attitudes and the role we play in shaping the world in which we live. It also shows us how to rescue ourselves and our societies from the sort of destructive one-sidedness that is causing our contemporary political divisions. Thank you for listening.